In this training video, we discuss designing and using reinforcement. This video is brought to you by the Delaware Network for Excellence in Autism. Let's begin our discussion by talking about the building blocks of behavior. The ABCs, or building blocks of behavior, is a model of understanding behaviors that is often used in educational and therapeutic settings with both children and adults. You may have heard of the ABCs of behavior. It stands for antecedent, behavior, consequence. This model is implemented to direct or change specific behaviors by noting what triggers the behavior and the results of the behavior. There are many advantages of this model. One important advantage is that it's so easy to record. While the method may be straightforward and simple, its implications are vast. Another benefit to this approach is that it's easily translatable to those outside of the original scenario. Professionals can share observations about a child's behavior in a way that is understood by those who weren't present during the original interaction. When behavior change is desired, this approach is an effective method to use. The ABCs of behavior have been used successfully by teachers, counselors, therapists, and other helping professionals to direct and modify both positive and negative behaviors in a variety of settings. The building blocks of behavior model is used to understand and modify particular behaviors, which then allows them to be addressed and changed. Let's keep this model in mind as we discuss reinforcement. Now, I would like to discuss consequences in more detail as they relate to learning. Specifically, let's talk about reinforcement. We know that in the ABC model, the consequence is any stimulus following the behavior that changes the likelihood a person will engage in that behavior again in the future. Reinforcement is a specific type of consequence that increases the likelihood a person will engage in the behavior again. Some specific possible reinforcers include money, praise, good grades, iPad, alone time, and play with toys. Here is an example of reinforcement. Your office starts offering points for exercising, so you decide to join a running group after work. You earn points on your Fitbit or other reward. In this situation, I already knew how to run. However, I was not previously running because I was just tired and wanted to watch TV instead. I had the skill of running in my repertoire, but it was easier to sit and watch TV. This takes a lot less effort. So, if I want to change my behavior, I need to figure out ways to increase my motivation, in this case, earning points towards rewards. When thinking about using reinforcement with our students in an effort to change behavior, sometimes we need to identify ways to increase motivation for them to engage in a desired behavior when the response effort is greater, even if the student already has that skill in their repertoire. There are two types of reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement. Both increase likelihood of future behavior through their presentation or removal of a stimulus. Positive reinforcement is when a stimulus is added after a behavior occurs, such as receiving a sticker for completing your worksheet. Negative reinforcement is when a stimulus is removed after a behavior occurs, such as when you're in a loud gym environment asking for a break and then being able to leave the gym for a quieter area. A few important notes. We always want to start with positive reinforcement whenever possible. Also, if we do not see an increase in future behavior, it was not reinforcement. Reward systems do not necessarily equal reinforcement. So, why use reinforcement? It is an evidence-based practice for teaching. It works for all learners. Using reinforcement provides feedback on a wide range of behaviors. When specific behaviors are consistently reinforced, it establishes a level of predictability and helps clarify what is expected. Reinforcement is not only helpful for academics, but for everything else involved in functioning in school and everyday life. Reinforcement is also beneficial when teaching functional skills or for increasing engagement. Another advantage of using reinforcement is that it's positive. It helps put focus on behaviors that we want to see. One type of reinforcement is specific praise. Research shows that increasing praise levels leads to a more positive environment. We should aim for 5 praise statements to every 1 corrective statement. That's a lot. In order to see the positive effects of reinforcement, we need to make sure we're using it correctly. There are certain key principles to follow when using positive or negative reinforcement to teach behavior. Let's talk more about each of these. Reinforcement should immediately follow the target behavior. We want to make sure that the student understands the connection between their behavior and the reinforcer. This will change once behaviors are learned and we want to focus on maintenance. Ideally, the student should not have free access to the reinforcement at other times. Reinforcement should fit the target behavior and be meaningful to the learner, as well as age appropriate. Remember, if it does not lead to an increase in future occurrence of behavior, it is not functioning as a reinforcer. Rewards do not equal reinforcement. We can provide something that the student likes after they engage in a behavior, but if the behavior does not increase, that thing was not a reinforcer. Multiple reinforcers are more effective than a single reinforcer. This really relates to the principle about fit and being meaningful. Preference assessment should be conducted regularly because we want to have a variety of potential reinforcers to choose from so that the student does not get satiated. Also, just because something functions as a reinforcer at one time for a given behavior does not mean that it will always function as a reinforcer. Lastly, it is important to note that pairing reinforcement can help with the process of increasing praise and/or other naturally occurring stimuli as motivators, and reduce reliance on contrived reinforcers such as food, toys, or other items that would not naturally occur in the environment. Behavior-specific praise can also help with strengthening the association between the target behavior and the reinforcer. Reinforcement does not equal bribery. Basically, it comes down to timing. If you said to your son or daughter, "Today, if we play nicely with each other at the park, we will go and get ice cream afterwards," that would be considered positive reinforcement. Well, if it increased desired behavior in the future. However, if you waited until your kids were fighting at the park and then said, "If you calm down and stop fighting, we can get ice cream," that would be considered bribery, because the challenging behavior is dictating the reward. On the slide, we have some examples and non-examples. Now, let's discuss the different types of reinforcers. There are 2 main categories of reinforcers, primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers, also referred to as unconditioned, satisfy basic biological drives and are necessary for survival. They are inherently reinforcing. Some examples include food, drink, air, and sleep. Secondary reinforcers, also referred to as conditioned, include social, tangible, activity, and exchangeable. This could include praise, toys, computer time, and tokens. When talking about sensory reinforcers as an activity, these are things like sensory rooms or activities that students really like but are not biologically necessary. When we say exchangeable, these are reinforcers that can be used to buy other primary or secondary reinforcers. So they really function as reinforcers through their association with other types. Also, if we always get something every time we get a primary reinforcer, that additional thing may become reinforcing. As an example, if every time we got food someone said good job may eventually become a reinforcer. Let's talk about the different types of potential reinforcers, each with pros and cons. Ultimately, our goal is for whatever is naturally occurring in the environment after the behavior to serve as the reinforcer, but we often have to start with something contrived. Edible reinforcers are foods or drinks that, when given to an individual following a behavior, increase the likelihood that that behavior will occur again in the future. Some potential positives of using edible reinforcers include that they are a primary reinforcer, so they should work as long as the student is hungry. They are also time limited, which could be helpful for a child who has a difficult time giving up preferred activities or items, because edibles, for example, have a clear end point. Some potential cons to using edible reinforcers include health and satiation. We do not want to be constantly providing food and cannot withhold food. Eventually, edible reinforcers may not work because a student is full. Also, edibles are not typically a natural reinforcer, although they could be, in an example such as completing a non-preferred task right before lunch. Tangible reinforcers can be any item that, when given to a person after a behavior, increase the likelihood the behavior will occur again in the future. They are secondary reinforcers. The potential pros of using tangible reinforcers include that they are often possible to identify through highly preferred toys or items. Potential cons of using tangible reinforcers include that the removal of highly preferred items can be challenging, and if they're not removed, they could be distracting. They are also potentially costly and not typically naturally occurring or age-appropriate in some cases. Next, an activity is a potential reinforcer that an individual participates in following a behavior that increases the likelihood the behavior will occur again in the future. Some examples include reading, exercising, recess, computer time, playing a game, singing, dancing, sensory activities such as playing with bubbles. It can be helpful to consider using an activity that the teacher can be involved in with the student. Some potential pros of using activities as reinforcers include that the activity could potentially be time limited, such as listening to a certain song. Also, if the teacher is involved in the activity, it can help with pairing. Some potential cons of using activities and reinforcers include that they can be challenging to transition away from. Also, activities may not necessarily be natural, but could be. For example, if the schedule is designed in such a way that preferred activities were part of the schedule and naturally followed a less preferred activity. Individuals with autism often have areas of interest. These could be certain activities, items, and/or topics. Areas of interest are secondary reinforcers. Some pros of using areas of interest as a potential reinforcer could include that they are often easily identified and are likely to function as a reinforcer. Some cons of using areas of interest as potential reinforcers include that they could be hard to move away from and, depending on the interests, may be potentially stigmatizing or not age appropriate. Another type of reinforcer is social and involves praise or other forms of attention from someone following a behavior that increases likelihood an individual will engage in that behavior again in the future. Some examples include praise, smiles, or proximity, such as sitting next to the teacher. Often, it can be helpful to pair other, less natural reinforcers with social reinforcement so that eventually the social reinforcement by itself is reinforcing. Some potential pros of using social reinforcers include they are readily available and relatively easy to implement. They may be a natural reinforcer in the environment, but that really depends on the student or individual's age and environment. Some potential cons of using social reinforcers include they may not be in and of themselves reinforcing for a student with autism. And while it may be a natural reinforcer, the high rates required for teaching a skill may not be natural to that environment. As mentioned previously, natural reinforcers are what would naturally occur following a given behavior. They could be primary or secondary, but it's basically whatever would naturally occur when a person engages in a particular behavior. It is our goal to use natural reinforcers, but we likely won't start here, but of course need to plan how to get here. Some pros of using natural reinforcers include that they are no cost or low effort required. They also facilitate maintenance because if what is naturally happening in the environment reinforces behavior, as long as that natural consequence continues, a person should maintain the behavior in similar contexts. Some cons of using natural reinforcers include that they are not always reinforcing initially, especially for our students with autism. Now that we've talked about reinforcement and discussed the types of potential reinforcers, let's talk about negative reinforcement. Again, it is important to use positive reinforcement first. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus following a behavior that increases likelihood the student will engage in that behavior in the future. It is important to note that using negative reinforcement involves the same principles previously discussed for positive reinforcement, meaning it should be contingent, meaningful, and varied. Some cautions when considering using negative reinforcement. Be sure not to use negative reinforcement to inadvertently strengthen negative behaviors. For example, removing a student from the classroom if they're being disruptive. Using negative reinforcement may take away from instructional time. Additionally, before using negative reinforcement, consider what is aversive in the setting. Is there something that could be done to make this setting less aversive? Is there a skill that could be taught or something else that could be changed? If so, it may be more useful to a student to provide supports to make that setting less aversive rather than continuing in that setting for the purposes of negative reinforcement. Now, we will provide an overview on how to plan and use reinforcement. On this slide, you see the steps involved for planning and using reinforcement. We will elaborate on each step in subsequent slides. But first, as an overview, you want to start with collecting data on the target skill or behavior. Next, you want to operationally define the target skill or behavior. Next, you want to identify reinforcers and then prepare your supporting materials. You also want to use and monitor your reinforcement. And then, finally, systematically thin your reinforcement. Let's talk about each of these steps in more detail. Step 1 is collecting data. Collect baseline data in various settings and activities to determine how often the student is using or not using the target behavior or skill across multiple contexts. First, you need to identify your data collection system and collect data on the baseline level of functioning, or again, how often the student is using that behavior or skill. It's really important to collect data across settings and activities prior to using reinforcement because the student's use of that behavior may differ, which has implications for the use of reinforcement. Also, you will want to plan on using that same data collection method once you start using your reinforcement in order to monitor progress. Step 2 is operationally defining the target skill. Based on the data collected, establish SMART goals and performance criteria towards meeting the goals. Make sure your goals describe a specific behavior or skill. Make sure your goals also describe the context or when the student is expected to engage in the behavior. Your goals should also describe how the team will know when the skill or behavior is mastered. You also want to ensure that your goals are attainable based on your baseline data. Performance criteria also allows team members to monitor progress and adjust reinforcement strategies as a student makes progress. For reinforcement-related goals, the first criterion or object should be easily attained so the student can be successful. Step 3 is to identify potential reinforcements. Remember that there are so many things that may function as reinforcers, and we want to individualize our reinforcement. Conducting regular preference assessments is key, as preferences can shift sometimes quickly, and preferences do not always equal reinforcement. Preference assessments can help us identify potential reinforcers. Indirect ways to identify potential reinforcers also includes asking the individual about their preferences or what they would like to work for. It can be helpful to observe or ask the family or a previous teacher what has been used successfully in the past. Direct ways to identify potential reinforcers includes completing informal observations, such as taking note of activities, objects, and foods that a student chooses when allowed free choice. Structured observations also help to identify reinforcers. The type of assessment that you may use will vary on the situation and the student. Additional considerations in identifying potential reinforcers include determining what natural reinforcers could be used or could work towards being used. Also, consider the student's age and, as much as possible, try to use reinforcers that are appropriate for the student's age and the setting that they're in. Step 4 is to prepare supporting materials. Supporting materials, in addition to the reinforcers themselves, can help clarify expectations and reinforcement contingencies. Different types of supporting materials can be used depending on the student and the reinforcement system. While visual supports aren't always necessary, they can help make things more clear and increase how quickly a skill is acquired. Reinforcer menus are also helpful to present options of reinforcers that a student can choose from prior to an activity. The menus can be pictures or icons, words or phrases, or even objects. A token economy is when a student earns exchangeables or tokens towards a reinforcer. A token board has spaces for tokens or checks and a visual such as a word or a picture to represent the terminal reinforcer or what tokens can be used towards. A token board could be as simple as a checklist with a space to put checks next to each item. Tokens should be attractive, easy to carry, easy to dispense, and age and developmentally appropriate. You could consider having a token store, where students can purchase items with tokens that they've earned. It is very important to note that you need to explicitly teach the token economy and adjust for the student's developmental level and target behavior. For example, the first time a token economy is introduced to a younger child, they may just start with earning 1 token before cashing in for the terminal reinforcer, and then you build from there. Another supporting material is a first-then visual. It is a similar concept to a token board, but works well for students who aren't ready for a token board because their reinforcement is more immediate. Here, we have some examples of visual supports for reinforcement. At the top left, you see a reinforcer menu. The reinforcement for completing the math worksheet is written out. Then, below the menu, you see a token board. The child selects what they are working for and then earns stars for engaging in the expected behaviors. Next, at the bottom left, you see a first-then support. You can see how it clearly shows that the child first completes work and then gets time on the computer. In the middle of the page, there is an activity checklist. Note how the child can add Velcro check marks when an activity is complete. At the top right, you see another first-then visual support. First, the child must clean up, and then they can work on a puzzle. And lastly, on the bottom right, you see another reinforcer menu for a token economy. The student knows how many tokens it takes to exchange for items at the store. Now, let's move on to talk about Step 5. How to use and monitor reinforcement. Remember, your reinforcement delivery will vary based on a student's learning stage and the reinforcement procedure that you've chosen. It is essential that the delivery of reinforcement is systematic and monitored. To explain, from the start, make sure there is a clear plan for how the reinforcement system will be used and how the plan will be adjusted as the student makes progress. You should also include a natural reinforcer and the plan to get there. In addition, continue to collect data using the same method used during baseline to monitor the student's progress once the reinforcement has started. Let's talk in more detail about how to use reinforcement to teach a new behavior. As mentioned, there are different phases of learning. The acquisition phase is when the student is first learning a new skill. This acquisition phase is where we start when we are using reinforcement. It is important in this phase to have continuous and consistent delivery of reinforcement to strengthen the association between the behavior and the reinforcer. Keep in mind this continuous schedule of reinforcement when choosing reinforcers and choose something that is effective but feasible. Ideally, the reinforcement should be occurring across settings that the student is expected to use the skill. Also, behavior should be reinforced even if additional support or help was necessary. It is simultaneously important to pair the delivery of reinforcement with behavior-specific labeled praise. We talked about satiation previously and have some additional tips to prevent during this high rate of reinforcement phase. First, vary reinforcers or use different reinforcers for different skills and behaviors. Teach the target skill or behavior during several short instructional sessions, as opposed to one long session where satiation is more likely. Frequently conduct preference assessments and select different reinforcers if satiation occurs. Avoid edibles or only use if nothing else has been identified for that student. Finally, switch from primary to secondary reinforcers as soon as possible. Let's move on to talk about Step 6, systematically thinning reinforcement. Once the student meets the initial criterion, it is important to systematically thin reinforcement. Thinning is reducing the amount of reinforcement delivered and/or increasing the response requirement for reinforcement. It is important to thin reinforcement because it is unrealistic to continuously deliver reinforcement each time a behavior occurs. Also, thinning reinforcement reduces the likelihood of satiation. If thinning reinforcement is done correctly and systematically, it increases resistance to extinction, or in other words, the student is more likely to maintain the skill or behavior over time. So, how do you thin reinforcement? Thinning reinforcement is done by systematically changing the schedule of reinforcement. You move from a continuous schedule of reinforcement to an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. We use the term schedule to refer to the rules that define when reinforcement is provided. Again, the timing of reinforcement or requirement for reinforcement may change. To explain, you may increase the demand prior to accessing the reinforcement. Also, you may change the schedules of reinforcement to intermittent, which means that rather than reinforcing each instance of behavior, you only reinforce some. An important point to make: for both increasing requirements and changing schedules of reinforcement, the thinning must be gradual and systematic. We caution against trying to move too quickly. Let's dive deeper into schedules of reinforcement, particularly as how the schedules relate to thinning reinforcement. As discussed, the schedules of reinforcement refer to the rules that define when reinforcement is provided. Schedules will differ depending on the phase of learning. We've already discussed schedules of reinforcement for teaching brand new behaviors. During this phase, continuous reinforcement is key. Once a behavior is learned and we are working on increasing fluency or maintaining that behavior, we move on to intermittent reinforcement. There are different types of intermittent reinforcement: fixed or variable, and time-based or interval-based. In a fixed ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided after a specified number of correct responses. In a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided after an average number of correct responses. In a fixed interval schedule, reinforcement is provided after a specified length of time. And finally, in a variable interval schedule, reinforcement is provided after an average amount of time. So, as you can see, you need to select a schedule to match your plan for increasing time or requirements of behavior in order to receive reinforcement. Using a consistent and systematic schedule of reinforcement provides a structured way to thin reinforcement within a token or point system. Let's explore how to use a token economy further. Using a token economy is one way to thin reinforcement. A token economy is when a student earns tokens for target behaviors. Once a predetermined number of tokens are earned, they can be exchanged for backup reinforcers. Token economies can be used to teach new behavior, increase motivation for tasks that students don't typically do independently, increase fluency with tasks to self-monitor and regulate behavior. Token economies also lend themselves to thinning schedules of reinforcement. For example, a student may move from a first-then visual to a token board, where initially one token earns the reinforcer. Then, you would increase either the number of responses or tokens required for reinforcement or the time until reinforcement is received. On the next few slides, we will talk more about how to implement a token economy. Here are the steps to using a token economy. First, describe the components of the token economy to the student. Explain the target behavior or skill in a way that the student will understand. Remember to use visuals and demonstration. Explain to the student that they will earn a token each time they use the target behavior or skill. Review how many tokens are needed before they can earn an item on their reinforcer menu. Next, provide a token each time the student displays the target skill initially. This is especially important when it is a new behavior and the student is just learning the token economy system. Finally, the students exchange their tokens for the chosen reinforcer. Once the student is familiar with the token economy and has met the goals for skill acquisition, begin to systematically thin reinforcement. Now, we want to take a moment to talk about behavior charts. We have some cautions and considerations about behavior charts, specifically the red, yellow, green stoplight and other color-coded clip charts. Some pros to using these types of behavior charts are that they provide students with feedback on their behavior and prompt adults to provide students with feedback as well. However, there are some significant negatives against using these charts. To explain, they are not evidence-based. While reinforcement in general has a lot of research to support it, there is no research for the use of behavioral charts like these. Also, getting clipped down or moved to a lower level or color may decrease student motivation and may make it difficult to regain momentum and encourage the student to move back up. When using these charts, the feedback may not be specific, or in other words, it may not tell the student what they should do and can often result in more emphasis on the negative behavior. Unfortunately, these types of charts can shame and embarrass students. Think of one of your job expectations. Imagine if your supervisor followed you around all day, monitoring your behavior, and clipped you down if you were not meeting expectations. For example, does your school have the expectation of no talking in the hallway? What if the principal clipped you down each time you were caught talking to a colleague in the hall? How would that make you feel? Would it motivate you to try harder to get clipped back up and get praise from the principal? Or would it embarrass you and make you want to stay away from the principal? So, in summary, we recommend that you consider using alternatives to behavior charts. Let's shift our focus back to some general cautions when using reinforcement. Be careful not to inadvertently reinforce the wrong behavior. Also, be careful not to use rewards that are not truly reinforcing. Again, we cautioned against the use of using systems without research support, such as clip charts. Also, be sure to plan for systematic thinning of reinforcement. Remember, by definition, reinforcement works. So, if it is not working, it is up to us to figure out why. Preferences change, so if a student is not making progress, consider if their chosen reinforcer is still functioning as a reinforcer. In general, using varied reinforcers and/or providing choices should help prevent satiation. Also, no amount of reinforcement is going to make a student do something that they do not know how to do. If preference assessments reveal that the chosen reinforcer is truly a reinforcer, think about supports needed to help the student be successful. If you're interested in learning more about these evidence-based practices, you may find additional resource guides and training videos on the DNEA website. To accompany this training and support your implementation of reinforcement, the DNEA developed the following resource guide. We encourage you to contact the DNEA for your training needs. Here are the references and resources used within this training video. Thank you.